Hello everyone, and welcome to the final section of this course where we will be taking a look at remote file inclusion vulnerabilities. So now that we've taken a look at directory traversal and local file inclusion, understanding remote file inclusion becomes much easier. Of course, remote file inclusion is also abbreviated to RFI. So while you may think of RFI and LFI as linked, they're not as linked as directory traversal and local file inclusion. In terms of the logic, of course, local file inclusion and remote file inclusion vulnerabilities share a lot of similarities. The only difference is that the actual resource or the file that you would like to include in the context now of remote file inclusion is a remote resource, which means the web application needs to support that particular functionality. What that means is that the web app needs to be making a request for a resource from another system and not making a request for a resource that is stored locally. That's pretty much the only difference that comes into play in terms of separating LFI from RFI. But enough of the discussion. Let's get that initial foray into RFI. So remote file inclusion, what is it? Well, remote file inclusion, or RFI, is a type of security flaw or vulnerability found in web applications that allow an attacker or attackers to include and execute remote files on a web server. This vulnerability arises due to improper handling of user-supplied input within the context of file inclusion operations. This vulnerability can have severe consequences based on what I've just said, including unauthorized access, data theft, and even full compromise of the affected server. So again, very, very simple. And as for the causes, they're the same culprits that we usually find. We have insufficient input validation. So the web application may not validate or filter user input, allowing attackers to inject malicious data. There's obviously a lack of proper sanitization. So even if input is validated, the application may not adequately sanitize the input before using it in file inclusion operations. And then, of course, using user input in file paths. So applications that dynamically include files based on user input are at serious high risk. And that actually makes sense. Imagine if, based on the examples we've looked at, if a web application within the URL or even the actual request allow a user to modify what resource is being requested for, in whatever way, then, and they do not validate that input to ensure that it meets specific, it matches specific parameters or specific requirements, then that, is always cause for concern. And then, of course, the other cause is failure to implement security controls. So developers might overlook security best practices. As we have seen with PHP, it's quite common, such as setting proper file permissions for security mechanisms like web application firewall. So it really all comes down to, as you have been able to see, and I hate looking back, but PHP has given us sort of a prime example as to the types of mistakes someone can make. And as you can see, they're fairly innocent mistakes. So bottom line is you need to ensure that you're validating whatever is being input, not that the input is dangerous. Again, going away from injection-based vulnerabilities, but if what is being injected or what is being input is pointing towards a resource that could be potentially dangerous, right? And in this particular case, you're most likely looking at a script. So in terms of the exploitation, it's fairly simple. And one thing that I would like to clarify, that in terms of LFI and RFI, the endpoints, generally speaking, are the same. The only difference is that what is being included is either locally, so a file stored locally on the system, or is being requested from another system, so remotely. So first step is identify vulnerable input. So the attacker identifies a web application that accepts user input and uses it in a file inclusion operation, typically in the form of a URL parameter or a post request parameter. Secondly, they inject a malicious payload. So the attacker injects a malicious file path or URL into the vulnerable parameter. For example, they might replace a legitimate parameter like page equals about.php, where the parameter name is page, which allows you to select a page. And if there is inclusion or the possibility of inclusion here, about.php can be replaced with something like HTTP, your IP address or your web server or the attacker's web server, and a malicious script. So what happens is that that particular script will get replaced and will be downloaded or included and will consequently be executed if there is provision for that execution. So point is, if you find a remote file inclusion vulnerability on a web server that is running PHP as the server-side scripting language, then your script needs to be in PHP, because that there's a higher chance that that will get executed, as we've seen in the arbitrary file upload section of this course. And then of course the server executes the malicious code. So when the web application processes the attacker's input, it dynamically includes the remote file or URL. This can lead to remote code execution on the web server, as the malicious code is included, or the malicious code in the included file is executed in the server's context. So very, very simple. It's just taking away the fact that whatever now is being included is coming from another system. And in order to do that, you just, generally speaking, need to specify the address of a web server or a system that can host that file, so that when a request is made, it can actually be retrieved. In terms of the impact, it's slightly more. RFI has a slightly higher impact than LFI for obvious reasons, but the first, of course, is unauthorized access. So attackers can read sensitive files on the server, including configuration files, password files, or application source code. You then have data theft, so confidential data such as user credentials or customer data may be stolen if it's accessible via the web server. You then have malware injection, where attackers can inject code or backdoors into the server, leading to complete control of the system, as we'll be doing in the next video. And then of course server compromise. If an attacker gains control over the server through RFI, they can execute arbitrary commands, something else we'll be doing, compromise the entire server, and potentially use it as a launchpad for further attacks, which is absolutely true. So that brings us to the end of the introduction to remote file inclusion vulnerabilities. As you can see, much simpler to understand now. And as you'll see, much simpler to exploit now, and will pretty much tie everything that we've covered in the entirety of this course together. And I'm serious about that. So that brings us to the end of the intro video. In the next video, we'll be taking a look at a lab that again will help us contextualize everything that I've stated in this particular video. So with that being said, that's going to be it for this video, and I'll be seeing you in the next video.